Let's dive into this topic of loneliness. So, from your perspective, Meredith, like how would you describe loneliness?
I see it as an emotional state that's caused by perceived isolation. So, the word perceived because it could be caused when we are completely alone. There's no one around, that's physical isolation. But it can also happen in social situations, in the family, when, if you've ever imagined like being surrounded by people and not understanding why you feel so lonely. So, that could be because maybe you feel unheard or unseen or misunderstood, or you sense hostility among the people, or otherwise you feel somehow alone in your perception of reality when everybody else is sort of subscribed to a different reality. So that can cause a deep and devastating sense of loneliness. And sometimes that kind of loneliness is actually much worse than the kind of loneliness that you feel when you're actually alone, because you can understand why you feel so alone. And sometimes, especially like in deep family dynamics, or with social groups, people that have been friends maybe all our life, it can be really hard to understand why we feel so lonely when we're surrounded by people. Or even if you live in a giant city and you walk outside and there's people everywhere, you can still feel so lonely. So they have a name for that particular kind of loneliness. They call it social pain. When you're surrounded by people, yet that feeling of loneliness is there. And that can be really devastating, the sadness and the despair that comes from that. And I also see loneliness that it could compound in nature. So it could be that there are multiple situations in your life in which you feel lonely, right? And or it could be the same certain situation that you're in that's like layered of loneliness. So how would that be? That could be, let's say you're in an abusive relationship and the person or people are isolating you both physically and or psychologically from other people. So that's like one layer of loneliness that you're going to feel. And then you add to that, let's say someday you start to talk to somebody about what's going on in that relationship, and the abuse might be very covert, it might be very difficult to see. So it's hard to explain and it's hard to put your finger on evidence that shows that this is abuse. So as you try to express this to someone, they don't believe you, like they don't see it. And so that adds a whole other layer of loneliness, because there you are again, alone in your perception of reality.
I love that. That's such a, I mean, I love your description of it and the situation, the obviously the scenario itself does not sound like fun. And I too have experienced that. I think we all probably have experienced some level of that social pain of being around a bunch of people and yet feeling so lonely. So yeah, I think that's so interesting how we can feel that way, whether we're actually physically alone or not, we can have that experience. So
Right.
and then I love that you also tied it into toxic relationships, and I want to talk a little bit about that more in a second. But since you're an expert in that field, I like that you tied it right back into that. So let's also tie in depression. So like, what do you see as, obviously this whole event we're tackling overcoming depression and loneliness? So what do you see as the connection between depression and loneliness?
So it's interesting. I read a little bit about what psychologists say, and they tend to describe it like a chicken and an egg scenario. Like it's hard to tell if the loneliness causes the depression or the depression causes the loneliness, like what came first. From my personal perspective, in my own life, and in observing like hundreds of people that I've talked to about this, I would say the loneliness comes first and then the depression. But what happens is it gets into this exacerbation cycle, and where then it becomes very difficult to tell like what is the actual cause. So what I see is like depression can have many causes. Some of those are organic, that can be caused from your diet, but it could also be caused from many other things like unresolved conflicts. And those can be internal conflicts, like, maybe your career and what you're doing in life, or your relationships and that kind of thing. It could actually be conflicts that you're having with other people. Depression can be caused also by toxic relationships, by abuse and trauma. People who have chronic illness, they can develop depression because they feel so alone in their experience of that illness. I've worked with a lot of people who have Lyme disease. For some reason, a lot of survivors of narcissistic abuse also have Lyme disease. And they told me it's like experiencing gaslighting and abuse all over again, because it's an invisible disease that it's impossible really to point at it. But then there's all these health manifestations that they have, including pain and all kinds of things. And then often their doctor doesn't really understand, doesn't really have any treatment options for them that work. So they end up feeling even more lonely and depressed. But so you can go through even loss and unprocessed grief. You can go through these life experiences, and we can say, okay, so depression is a symptom essentially of what we're going through. But often every one of these situations has some kind of loneliness in there. And I think if we try directly to treat the depression, that's why depression usually doesn't heal. Depression is almost impossible to treat directly, because I think it's usually a secondary symptom of something else. So it's like if you go to the doctor and they give you a drug for a symptom, right? But they don't go for the core of what's actually wrong. They go to the symptom. So maybe the drug suppresses the symptom, and then maybe other symptoms start coming up because that's being suppressed. But then also that symptom festers, and then we'll end up creating a much worse problem because we haven't got to the core. And I think most often when people are depressed and they don't understand why, and sometimes they just call that, well, it's just clinical depression, you're just depressed. But why though? And there's always a reason, I think, and it usually stems from some kind of loneliness that the person is feeling in their life. So I would recommend that people go towards the loneliness, because what's going to happen is, let's say something in your life is causing the loneliness. Then over time, the loneliness persists, you develop depression. Then over time, the isolation, the sadness, the despair of that depression gets worse. You get more lonely. The loneliness causes more depression. So there you are in this downward spiral. And the heaviness of these feelings, it is impossible to explain to somebody who hasn't had the experience, but the heaviness of these feelings is like stronger than the force of gravity. So it feels like it's inescapable. It becomes like this never ending heaviness that you feel like you can't get out once that spiral. And like the deeper you get into that spiral, it's like the heavier that force of gravity is on you.
AVAIYA has changed my life.
AVAIYA has made me the woman I am today.
AVAIYA is my home.
AVAIYA is personal freedom.
AVAIYA is the reason my life continuously improves.
Let everyone in your life know about AVAIYA.
Everyone needs to know about this amazing company.
Thank you, AVAIYA, for appearing in my inbox.
What ALLEN and Ande Anderson have created at AVAIYA is what the world needs.